Joining us now, I'm honored to say, is the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. Madam Vice President, we're really honored to have some time with you tonight. Thank you so much for being with us.
Of course, good to be with you, Rachel, and everyone. Thank you.
So you have been hearing some of the response to the debate, the same response that we have been both issuing and also hearing ourselves. I think a lot of people who are fans and supporters of President Biden, or who are Democrats, or who are just worried about the prospect of Donald Trump returning to the presidency, feel like this was not a strong performance tonight from President Biden. I want to hear your assessment and how you respond to those critics.
Well, it was a slow start. There's no question about that. But I thought it was a strong finish, and in particular because what we know is that when you look at the two sides of the ledger, what we had in Joe Biden is someone who wanted to have a debate based on facts, based on truth. And in Donald Trump, we had what we have come to expect, which is someone who is going to push lies and distract from the reality of the damage he has created and continues to create in our country. When I think about the significance of the substance of what is before us in November in 130 days, we are looking at a president in Joe Biden who has done historic work, whether it be on addressing the infrastructure issue in America. Donald Trump, remember, kept talking every week was going to be an infrastructure week. It never happened. It was Joe Biden that made it happen, so that over $1 trillion is hitting the streets of America to upgrade roads and bridges. You look at what Joe Biden has been able to accomplish in terms of delivering for the American people, whether it be the creation of 15 million new jobs, over 800,000 manufacturing jobs, bringing manufacturing back to the United States, what we have done to cap the cost of insulin at $35 a month, finally taking on Big Pharma and allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices. These are the substantive issues that the American people care about. And what we saw tonight is more of the same. Joe Biden fighting for the American people, Donald Trump fighting for himself, not to mention on the issue of choice. There was a very clear contrast. Joe Biden is very clear when the bill comes before him to put back in law the protections of Roe v. Wade, he'll sign it. What we know about Donald Trump, no matter how much he's trying to distract us from this, is when he was president, he hand-selected 3 members of the United States Supreme Court with the intention they would undo the protections of Roe. That's exactly what they did. And now we see in case after case, state after state, laws designed to punish healthcare providers. In Texas, provide prison for life for doctors. Women who are having miscarriages because and bleeding out, excuse my language, but I'm just going to have to be explicit about the facts, because of laws that are denying them emergency care because hospitals are afraid they're going to be criminalized for doing that. And all of these bans are Trump abortion bans. He's talking about how he wants to send this decision back to the states. And we know what those arguments are about. Joe Biden has been very clear about where he stands, and he is clear with the American people. He is clear in purpose. And I think that came across tonight in this debate.
You know, the issue of former President Trump lying came to the fore on this issue of choice and on this issue of abortion rights in a very pointed way. He kept asserting over and over again that if you are pro-abortion rights, or if you want to codify Roe, or if you are a critic of the decision to overturn Roe and have these abortion bans, then you are a murderer, and that you want to kill infants, and that what people who are pro-choice are people who want to kill babies after they are born. And I sometimes say this is Earth 2. This is not a factually based thing at all. But he repeatedly reiterates that. It's not the moderator's job, though, to fact check that. It's essentially the other candidate's job to fact check that. I wonder what your thought just strategically is in terms of countering a counter narrative and a lie about abortion rights that's so obscene and yet so insistently repeated by their side and by their candidate.
Well, the facts are exactly what are on our side, to your point, Rachel. First of all, what they are talking about is they are attempting to, as they are wont to do, especially Donald Trump, create fear based on fiction. For the sake of getting and hitting political points. What we know and what he is acutely aware of is what he has done and intended to do is not politically popular with a lot of people in both so-called red states and blue states. And so now you see him wavering. Let's not forget, when he was president of the United States, He said that if a national abortion ban was sent to his desk, he would sign it. He said that. As Maya Angelou told us a long time ago, when people tell you who they are, take them at their word. Believe them. We know that when Donald Trump comes in, if he has a Congress that passes a national abortion ban, he will sign it into law. One of the most fundamental issues of our time. Fundamental. The idea that the government would take the ability of an individual's to make decisions about their own body and replace their good judgment with that of the government. That's what's happened in our country. 3 days ago, we just commemorated the 2-year anniversary of the Dobbs decision, and where woman after woman who I have met, who I have traveled with, have faced extraordinary experiences of miscarriage, of losing their ability to have children in the future because they did not receive the care they needed, because hospitals and healthcare providers were afraid they'd be put in jail for doing the job of caring for these women. So I think that what Donald Trump is doing is grasping for straws. And look, they're only, of the 2 people on that debate stage, only one of them has the endorsement of his vice president. And let's not forget that. Let's not forget that.
Very awkward and very, very true. Vice President Kamala Harris, it's a privilege to have this time with you tonight. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time, madam.
Good to be with you guys. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a lot more questions to ask her. I want to do a much longer interview with her. We only had a couple of minutes.
She just became so much more important to this campaign than she was yesterday.
Absolutely.
What we just heard in her first response to you was more powerful, clearer, stronger than anything we heard from her running mate tonight.
Yeah.
She and in her second response. And so that was the kind of thing people were hoping for from President Biden on the stage tonight. She just delivered it. And the question becomes for the campaign starting tomorrow. Obviously, Joe Biden needs this kind of support. He needs others to be out there more than any other presidential candidate maybe ever has. He needs others to be out there doing this campaign work. She's the one who can get the most attention as a campaign.
How do you weave the vice president's skills, including her communication skills, which we just saw on blast there?
Yeah.
How do you weave those with the president's in a way that doesn't upstage him and that doesn't make people want to replace him with him?
You cannot anymore worry about that old idea of upstaging the president.
You think that's
not
over
in this
tonight?
situation.
Yeah.
You know, historically, the most active use of vice presidential candidates has been as attackers of the other side. There are some examples. Harry Truman in 1944 was brought in literally for energy. Literally, to go out there. He was kind of an attacker, but he was also this energy source that FDR just could not ever deliver as a campaigner. This is a situation where you're just going to have to give her the ball, let her do more of that. But let me just add one more thing. If we had said to her, I'm going to ask you a question. You have 2 minutes to respond. We're going to cut your mic. We're going to cut your mic at the end of the 2 minutes. That would be a lot stiffer. It would not be as fluid. It would not be as confident. There'd be a lot more pressure. It changes. That debate stage changes everything about human communication.
And by the way, quietly, the Biden campaign has been using her that way. It's just it's not covered as much. But Vice President Harris has been all over this country. She is the primary voice they use on college campuses. She's been the voice they've been using really heavily in the Black community. She's the one who they've been sending out because she is a voice that is younger, that is more approachable for younger audience. So they're using her that way anyway. And one of the big criticisms of the Biden White House is that they kind of hid her for 2 years and really didn't use her that much and really didn't allow her because of this whole issue of is she going to upstage President Biden. But I think the reality is her role, as Lawrence just said, it just went up so much higher. It's really important that they allow her to be herself because she is personable. She is a great communicator. And at this point, she is the vigor on the campaign. Yeah. She's the vigor on the ticket. And she's the person who can reassure folks that, look, President Biden is a great decision maker. He may not be the most energetic dude in the world, but he's got this lady who's also making decisions. They're making decisions together. She is the partner in the administration as he was to Barack Obama.
Yeah, I mean, they also used her on abortion rights. By they used her, it's also about her choice on what she goes out there and does. And I think it took her some time in the first year or two to figure out what her space and role was, right? What it was going to be. And the best presidential and vice presidential partnerships publicly, I mean, in terms of what they do publicly, is where they have different strengths.
Yeah.
Joe Biden is clearly not super comfortable talking about abortion rights beyond his strong defense of Roe. That is not where Chris is nodding here.
I mean, that's the understatement of the century, but yes, continue.
It's clearly, she is very comfortable.
He's very Catholic.
And
Yes.
he's very Catholic. She is very comfortable. She's passionate. I mean, she almost got a tear to her eye, which, by the way, is how millions of women are feeling across the country. They should have her out on every morning show. I know it's midnight, so I'm sorry, Vice President Harris. But they should have her out on every morning show tomorrow.
Yes.
And I think early on, not because it was warranted, she was not confident in her own ability to do an interview like the one she just did, or to go do a round of morning shows. She clearly can do it. She's a very strong communicator. And what her message on abortion rights, to Joy's point, is exactly what she's been doing around the country. It just hasn't been covered nationally.
Can I just say that her office should have let us go 20 minutes with her?
Yes, I agree with that.
I mean, you only get what you get from the wife. But no, come on.
It's emblematic, though. I have to say, it is emblematic of the staffing. Is that they'll give you 10 minutes with her when they should give you 30 because
they need to start really trusting Vice President Harris to cut her own path. Because
Absolutely.
she does very, very well, and the more you get of her, the better it is.
That's right.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.